Recently, I've been invited to give a few talks on online in an international forum, and some of them were recorded, but I think they could be improved upon, and I will try to record a better version here for us to watch. And okay, the talk is titled Translating Symptoms into Brain-Related Disturbances. And there is a conflict of interest revelation here that everything in this talk is also related to a startup company that is planned to start, but doesn't exist yet. And the talk tackles a critical need that I think is in the basic of continuous crisis characterizing psychiatry from its beginning and relevant till today. And we can exemplify that using a clinical situation that often happens in the clinic. The patient comes to the psychiatrist and complains, "Doctor, I'm sad, depressed, what do I have?" And the clinician would typically give his diagnosis: you have depression. Now, the intelligent patient would ask himself, I just told you that, what added value, is there anything else that you can tell me? And typically the psychiatrist will not have anything more to say other than that diagnosis of depression. Now, this is problematic because depression is descriptive, it's like stomachache. You come to your family practitioner and you say, "Doctor, I have a stomachache. What do I have?" And he will tell you, "You have a stomachache." You won't be satisfied with this response. You would like him to do some kind of diagnostic procedure and come up with a diagnosis like appendicitis or something similar. And when you say appendicitis, appendix is a location in the body, it's part of the gastrointestinal system, and it is infected. So the name of the disease is the cause of the disease. This is called etiological diagnosis. While when you say depression, it's not a place in the body and it's not any kind of mechanism. So it is actually just a descriptive diagnosis, description of symptoms. Now, why is that so critical, the difference? Because in order to fix something, in order to cure patients, you have to know what to do, what to fix. So when you say appendicitis, it's a location in the body. You know that you go to this location, not anywhere else. And you know what you need to do. You have to extinguish the infection. But if you don't know what's wrong with the patient, if you don't have a location and mechanism like in depression, then what are you going to treat? What are you going to do in order to cure the patient? And this explains why much of the treatments in psychiatry, especially for severe illnesses, are very ineffective. And I think this stage of knowing what's wrong with the patient, of discovering the etiological baseline for mental disorders, cannot be overlooked and cannot be bypassed. Until we know what's wrong with our patients, we will not be able to cure them. Now, most psychiatrists would agree that it is related to the brain. But surprisingly, we don't have the term brain in any of the psychiatric diagnoses. We don't hear diagnoses like brainitis, brainosis, or something like that. So here I will argue, and what I'm trying to argue in these talks, is that there is enough knowledge out there to begin and reformulate mental disorders as brain disorders. There is a huge body of knowledge in neuroscience, and specifically in systems neuroscience, something like computational neuroscience, which when approached to and united with knowledge that we have about phenomenology, will become relevant and can already today begin and reformulate mental disorders as based on what we know. So now we will take a quick look from an overview of some big issues in neuroscience which are related to the clinic. It won't be in depth, it won't be at a low resolution, it will be just general assumptions and knowledge about the brain as a whole system organization. And see how we can use that to come up with an initial formulation of etiological diagnosis for psychiatry. So what do we know about the brain? We know that the brain has types of organization which reflect whole brain organization. For example, we know that the brain is hierarchical. You have unimodal, multimodal, and transmodal interactions in the brain, auditory, visual, somatosensory, and so on, which combine into multimodal. We combine what we see with what we hear and with what we feel. And on top of that, at the highest levels of the hierarchy, we have everything integrated with everything, which is transmodal integration. Now, the transmodal integration is supposedly responsible for higher mental functions, such as consciousness, for example. We know that in mental disorders, consciousness is typically disturbed, fragmented, the patient is perplexed, distorts reality. And consciousness is a characteristic of the brain as a whole. So it will be an emergent property. Emergent meaning that the characteristic of the whole is more than the sum of elements. Okay, so one neuron, two neurons don't have consciousness, they don't have personality, they don't have mood, they don't have higher mental functions. But the whole brain organization is responsible for the higher mental functions. So when we have a whole brain organization, like you see in green here, this represents the conscious experience. And from instant to instant, in a millisecond range sequence, the organizations change and the content of consciousness is changed. So we feel consciousness as a serial process. Now we know much more about the brain. We know that the brain is a small world network organization. Small world network meaning that nearby connections are dense and you have few faraway connections. So you have clusters of nearby connections and less connections far away in the brain. And this type of organization is most optimal for information processing and probably characterizes the normal brain, the brain that is asymptomatic. It is also an organization that is relevant for the hierarchy that we find. So you have these hubs of faraway connections connecting many, many clusters of nearby connections. So you get this hierarchy coming out of this type of organization. Now, there is a balance between these connectivity patterns. So if the nearby connections are reduced, as you can see here, down in this drawing here, then the system becomes random. And if you have increased clustering coefficients, increased connections compared to faraway connections, then the systems tend to freeze and fixate or repeat the same activation, reducing the space of the number of activations, okay? Now the brain balances this connectivity, so we are actually balancing overconnectivity and disconnectivity, but this could be disturbed and the brain could move either way. And we know that if the brain moves towards a disorganized unstable, random activity, then we get something that was described in the literature as disconnection dynamics, which has been repeatedly proven to be related to psychosis. And actually, if you're a clinician, you know that in psychosis, the patient becomes disoriented, fragmented, consciousness breaks down, he begins to hear things that don't exist, he has statistically independent activations of brain processes that are not connected to each other, his thought will be disoriented, disorganized, jumping from one concept to another. Assuming that neural ensembles represent thought, if they're disconnected from each other, then you have thoughts that are unrelated, and loosening of association would be the clinical manifestation of that. Connectivity will be also the cause of the disturbance of a hierarchical organization, and top-down, bottom-up processes would be disturbed. So for example, if you have domination of a top-down process, of some kind of an idea which is unrelated to the incoming information of the bottom-up process, then false assumptions and false ideations about the environment can occur, and this would be expressed in the clinic as delusions. On the other hand, if the higher level of brain organization do not mature, there is a bottom-up insufficiency, then the highest levels will be disturbed. And Marcel Meshulam talked about higher levels of brain integration related to volition, where you have a motivation of acting in the motor system upon the integrity of the sensory system. So the highest levels, when they're disturbed, can explain avolition and reduced activity of negative symptoms, typical also to schizophrenia. So building upon these insights, we begin to see that an imbalance of optimal brain connectivity could be an underlying mechanism, for example, for the clinical manifestations of schizophrenia, where you have psychosis, the brain disturbed into a disconnection dynamics. And then trying to correct it will become overconnected and reflect negative symptoms, the post-psychotic negative symptoms. And as the disease progresses, it reflects actually a collapse of the optimal brain connectivity, oscillating between negative and positive conditions. So here we can begin to see how this type of organization of small world network stability can be compared metaphorically to cardiac arrhythmia. You have cardiac arrhythmia causing cardiac insufficiency, and having this collapse like brain arrhythmias reflecting and causing brain-related insufficiency, so brain insufficiencies, like in schizophrenia. What else do we know about the brain? Other than that, we know the brain develops from infancy to adulthood, creating phases that have to do with massive synaptic connectivity, which is then become pruned. Pruning causes the system to become a small world network in the adult, while in children, small world network is not formed yet. We also know that the brain is capable of representing internal information, which reflects the outside experience. So for example, we know about maps in the brain, like the homunculus. And we know that neural ensembles can represent concepts like a banana, apple, could be represented as clusters of connecting units. And we know actually that memories are built upon Hebbian algorithm, Hebbian meaning Donald Hebb talked about fire together, wire together. So when we learn something, we have ensembles of neurons connecting to represent these objects. And the memory would be activation of these ensembles. And we can take it further, and we know that the whole world, including the psychosocial world, is also represented in the brain. And we have representation of ourselves, what we know about ourselves, introspection. We have knowledge about others. We know how they will behave, how they look like, how will they react. And we also know what would be the interpersonal relationship between them and us. And you can actually do simulations in the brain where we say to ourselves, if I tell my friend this and that, he will react like this. Also, I should not tell him anything, or maybe I myself am not confident enough, I won't do this. Things that actually shape our interpersonal relationship and actually create what we can call personality traits. So we actually have an internal representation of the psychosocial world, which determines our interpersonal relationships and traits, and actually our personality maturation and type. So personality disorders could be related more to basic networks that develop from childhood to adulthood and represent the way that we interact psychologically and our personality traits. Something else that we know about the brain, and this will be the last section, we know that the brain is very dynamic, and we know that the brain adapts to the environment. This is sometimes called Bayesian brain because of Bayesian statistics. The brain predicts what is going to happen in the environment and adapts to it. The adaptation is a two-way direction. Either the brain can alter and adapt its internal representation to what is happening, or it can act motorically through the motor systems on the environment and mold, change the environment to suit what is internally represented. So if you want to tidy your room or to organize your room, your house, you have an image in your brain how you want it to be, and you act upon the environment in order to make it suited to what you have in your mind. But if you tackle some kind of problem that you cannot change the environment, then you have to adapt to what is occurring, what is happening, and you can do that by altering and adapting your internal representation to be suited to the environment. So the brain continuously acts to adapt to a changing environment, and if the match is good, then there is a delta that can be measured between the environment and the brain, and this delta is reduced because there is a good match between the environment and the brain. The opposite is also correct. If there is a mismatch, something in the environment changes, and the brain has not adapted to it, then the delta, the difference between the brain and the environment, will be increased. Carl Freestone calls this delta free energy because he measures it and calculates it using entropic measurements. So if there is a good match, there is reduction of free energy, and when there is a bad match, there is mismatch, then the free energy increases. And the healthy, adaptable brain acts continuously to reduce the free energy. So the environment is dynamic, changes, and the brain adapts to it, reducing the free energy. Now we will assume here that when free energy is increased, the brain is not adaptive enough, then this kind of dynamics moving from non-optimal to a more non-optimal condition will be accompanied by an emergent property of depressed mood, and the opposite. When you have good match dynamics moving to a better match, then that will have an elevating antidepressant effect. And this is also intuitive. If you have, for example, an exam, and you want to succeed in the exam, you know that you want to succeed in the exam, and you fail the exam, then there is a mismatch between your expectation, internal representation, and what occurred in the environment. This mismatch will be frustration and depression. You won't be happy failing the exam. But the opposite, if you succeed in the exam, then you optimize the internal representation. And this optimization dynamics is a satisfactory elevating mood antidepressant effect. So how does the brain do this kind of continuous matching? We assume and we know that the brain actually organizes as a whole in 3 types of organization. Okay, executive networks, salient networks, and default mode networks. Now, the salient network has the scope of allowing very fast millisecond range interaction with the environment of the executive network to incorporate and adapt to the environment by creating internal representations. The internal representations that we talked about before are related to the default mode network. The basic organization of the brain, which is a continuous and reflects the organization of the brain from childhood to adulthood. And in between these dynamics, we have the salient network, which continuously helps the adaptation of the brain to represent the environment internally. So when you have optimization dynamics, it has an antidepressant effect. And when you have a de-optimization dynamics, it has a depression emerging effect. Clinically, this combines very well with our knowledge, because what we know today, which is basically very, very strong, we know that antidepressants are plasticity-inducing substances. So they generate plasticity, more spines and more dendrites, okay? And now we can, and no one really understands why increased plasticity should be related to mood. But if we look at the brain as a Bayesian brain dynamics, then now we can understand that with more plasticity, with more spines and dendrites, the brain does a better job of Bayesian brain adapting to the environment and reducing all the time, reducing the free energy, the delta, and creating better match. And that will be accompanied by antidepressant effect and can explain depression. It can actually explain reactive depression and endogenic depression. Reactive depression would be any change, stressful event in the environment has a big change in the environment and thus increases the delta, causing depression. And also in normal environments, when there is no stress, the environment always changes, and if the brain becomes less plastic, like in dementia and metabolic disease, then the depression can come out just because the free energy is increased, not able to adapt to normal changes in the environment. So we'll have a depression that is presumably coming from the brain itself, endogenic, and not from the environment. So here we have one model that explains both types of old terminology, reactive depression and endogenic depression. So now when we have set in motion all these huge superficial knowledge about the brain, and we know that we have an executive network which is responsible for fast millisecond range, connectivity balanced, activity interacting with the environment. We have a default mode network which develops over time and represents internal representations and internal traits. And we have a salient network that combines the activity between those 2 extremes of brain organization and directing it toward a dynamic of reducing free energy. So now that we know this, we can actually begin and build a diagnostic system which is based on etiology. Etiology meaning the location in the body and the dynamic process or pathology that is occurring in the brain. So we can build upon the executive network, the salient network, and the default network as locations, global types of locations in the cortex, in the brain. And we can build on mechanisms which are related to time windows. So we have a very fast millisecond range window for pathologies that relate to cognitive, very fast perception, thought, like in schizophrenia, for example. Then we can build upon time scale of weeks to months for mood changes, because we know very well that when you give antidepressants to patients, it takes 1.5 months for the change to happen. So the dynamic of antidepressant mood changes are related to this kind of time windows. And we know that personality is related to our experience from birth to adulthood. So we have a lifelong time window also that could be applied to this type of pathology. Now we can take the pathology that we know, the psychopathology, have this spectrum. On one side, we have schizophrenia, then we have anxiety and mood disorders and personality disorders. This covers most of the phenomenology of psychiatric illness and build upon that. So we assign the millisecond range pathologies to schizophrenia, the minute range to anxiety, panic attacks take 5 minutes, few minutes, mood disorders related to weeks and months, and personality disorders related to long life. On top of that, we assign the different networks, and we can now begin and describe the etiological origin of this type of phenomenology. So schizophrenia would be a disconnection, overconnection dynamics, and disturbance of the small world network. So here you have terminology which is brain-related instead of psychosis. Depression and anxiety would be related to Bayesian brain dynamics. Anxiety, I did not describe it here, but it is a general destabilization of the network, which has an emergent property of anxiety. And the dynamics of optimization and de-optimization of a Bayesian brain describe mood alterations. So depression will be de-optimization. Mania would be hyper-optimization. The brain can oscillate between these two types of dynamics, having bipolar disorder. So now you can see that instead of using a terminology like depression, which is descriptive symptoms, you can talk about the optimization of Bayesian brains and increase free energy. All of these terminologies are related to the brain, etiological. Finally, we can describe personality disorders as biases, immaturity, and disturbances to the internal representations, which cause the patient to react in a maladaptive way. And if you go deeper into this kind of formulation, you can see that it begins to make sense, also combining the different phenomenologies. So we know that personality disorders manifest by depression. So it is just normally and just logical to think that if you have bad internal representation which do not match what is occurring in the environment, you have biased internal representations, this will increase the free energy and will be maladaptive. There will be mismatch, a lot of mismatch in personality disorders. So it is just normal that in the clinic you find personality disorders typically complaining about depression. So we can actually create this kind of translation which can conceptually bring us towards a diagnostic system which is etiological. There is a vicious cycle in psychiatry. We didn't prove this etiological diagnosis. We didn't prove that psychosis is a disconnection, overconnection, although there is a lot of literature about it. We didn't prove that Bayesian brain is related to mania. So if we didn't prove it as a scientist, we don't use it. But if we will never use it, we will never get out of this trap of a diagnostic descriptive system, which will allow us to think what might be wrong in the patient and find it and do research or reformulate it in such a way that we can actually check it. It is like testable hypothesis that we must generate in order to break down this vicious cycle, not using it because we didn't prove it, and not proving it because we didn't use it. Okay, I hope this gives some material to thought. And there are a lot of parts that are related to this kind of lecture, which talk about how we will prove it in the future, how we can use the intuition of this type of diagnosis today already with the existing therapies. But this could be for another different talk. So if you want to comment on this video, please go to neuroanalysis instead of psychoanalysis, neuroanalysis. And you'll find all the contact information that you can join. Actually, we have a neuroanalysis society, and you can join us. And this video will also be distributed to the society. Thank you very much, and see you.